I'm delighted now to welcome to the Nudgestock stage a man who you're going to find absolutely wonderful. He's the world's comedians are fantastic psychologists, but the world's psychologists can also be fantastic comedians. He's been looking at why we find what makes this thing so funny for over a decade. He's the director of the Humour Research Lab, and he has a podcast called I'm Not Joking. I'm delighted to introduce to the Nudgestock stage, Pete McGraw.
So good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. It's 7 a.m. My time in Hollywood, California. I think it's best that I start with the bad news. Well, there's actually a couple pieces of bad news. First one is I have yet to have Rory on I'm Not Joking. That needs to happen at some point when we can get into the same room. The other piece of bad news is I am not going to be as funny as you want me to be. And that is for some obvious reasons, as you probably have figured out from the pandemic. Zoom is not the ideal context for comedy, although the one good advantage is that you can drink in these meetings versus in your actual meetings at work. Now, the good news is that I am not going to ask you to be funnier at work. And the reason I'm not going to do that is first of all, it's not really the best solution to most of your professional problems, although being funny may be useful for your brands at times, and it may be useful for some people on occasion. But really the problem is if I tell 30,000 Nudgestock attendees to go forth and be funny, we need to be worried about that guy, and that guy is typically a guy, and he is often a middle-aged guy like me, and he hasn't been out on a date in a while, also like me. That guy'd be lucky to get a speaking gig at Nudgestock. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to ask you to think funny. That is, to think differently, to think like the world's funniest people. Now, the reason to do that is that most of our pressing problems are going to be solved with a bit of creativity and innovation. So let me step back for a moment and talk about how I got to this argument. So I started off as kind of a run-of-the-mill behavioral economist before they were being called behavioral economists. So now, about 12 years ago, I was giving a dry, esoteric talk at an American university. For those of you who are not familiar with academia, you'll get invited to a university, you'll get put up in a hotel, you'll be given a nice meal, you get to meet with all the faculty, and they'll kind of poop on your ideas for about an hour and a half as part of a talk. The talk that I was giving was on religious marketing and how people find religious marketing to be at times morally wrong. And I gave a kind of provocative example of a moral violation in religious marketing. This church in Tampa, Florida, had raffled off, in order to get people to go to their winter retreat, a yellow H2 Hummer SUV. And my audience chuckled at this idea, and a hand went up in the back of the room, and I was asked the most important question of my professional life, and that is, you just pointed out that moral violations cause anger and disgust, and yet we're laughing. Why? I went back to Boulder, Colorado, my home university, puzzled over that question, designed some answers to it, started publishing more dry, esoteric papers, and then one day was approached by a journalist, and I ended up finding myself standing on a stage at a divey bar in Denver, Colorado, telling jokes and bombing badly. And it was that experience that led me to write my first book called The Humor Code, A Global Search for What Makes Things Funny, where I travel around the world sort of cracking the humor code. So I clowned with Patch Adams in the Amazon jungle. I went to Palestine to look at humor where you least expect it. Spent time in green rooms with Japanese comedians to figure out those crazy Japanese game shows. And as along the way, I just really figured out a lot about the craft of comedy and realized, yes, these comedians create a lot of value for us, but we can learn from the way they create that value. So my most recent book, called Shtick to Business, really brings together my day job teaching MBAs and my night job decoding comedy to present these lessons. So there's like 21 lessons in the book. Rory tells me I can only do 2, so let's just jump into those 2 right now. So as I said, I want people to think funny. That is to try to emulate the practices and perspectives of these creative geniuses. So one of those places that you can see this is in a comedy 101 technique called the reversal. So in chapter 1, I talk about reverse it. And so comedians think in reverse. So they think in reverse in terms of their punchlines. So for example, the king of the one-liners, Henny Youngman, has a quip. It said that when I read about the dangers of drinking, I stopped. And everybody expects reading. Everybody expects drinking, and you get reading, right? So when I read about the dangers of drinking, so you can tell I'm not a comedian, and also that it's first thing in the morning for me right now. When I read about the dangers of drinking, I stopped reading. You can also find reversals in the premises for comedic movies, TV shows, etc. So the movie Trading Places with Dan Aykroyd and Eddie Murphy, the characters, high status, low status person trades places. In Amy Schumer's Trainwreck, it is a reverse rom-com. So in the movie, the Amy Schumer character plays the sort of stereotypically male character, right? So rom-coms are boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. In this case, the girl is a boy, and hilarity ensues. So thinking in reverse can help overcome the status quo bias. I'm sure this has been a topic that's come up over and over again, the dangers of the status quo and the difficulties of overcoming it. But one of the beautiful things about thinking in reverse is not only does it help overcome the status quo bias, when you do overcome it, it puts you in a completely different space. It puts you far, far away from everyone else. And that is because most people don't think in reverse. So I'll give you an example of this. So suppose you're 2 Brooklyn-based entrepreneurs and you're looking to compete with Apple and Samsung in the smartphone market. Right? That's a pretty tall order. How do you outsmart Apple? Well, these 2 entrepreneurs thought in reverse. They didn't come up with a smarter phone. They came up with the dumb phone. And so the Light Phone 2, aka the dumb phone, exceeded its funding goal on Indiegogo by 600%. Right? This is a phone that is designed not for people who want to be more connected, it's for people who want to be less connected. And it offers just the very basics: navigation, phone calls, texting, and alarm, and so on. And so they've carved out an interesting niche by thinking in reverse. Another way that you can think about the reversal is this idea of turning bugs into features. And so this is something that comedians do all the time. So they for example, often start their stand-up comedy sets with a little bit of self-deprecation, pointing out how they're too tall, they're too short, they're too hairy, they're too bald, they're too skinny, they're too fat. Whatever it is that's wrong with them, they use as a way to create comedy, to create likability, to create accessibility, to be able to critique themselves. And when they can critique themselves, then they can critique the world around them. So this idea of turning a bug into feature is a really useful way, I think, to think in reverse. I'll give you one example of this that you can find in the business world. So the Canadian cough syrup company Buckley's was like number 9 in the marketplace. And as you can imagine, if you're the number 9 cough syrup in a marketplace, you are struggling. Well, Buckley's had a problem. And one of the problems, besides being number 9, is that their cough syrup tasted awful, truly awful. So what do? You've got this awful tasting cough syrup. You're number 9 in the marketplace. Well, you could change the formula. You could dump a bunch of sugar and cherry flavor in there. Or you could do what Buckley's did, which is to start a campaign where they point out it tastes awful and it works. And they really leaned into this idea, right? It's not that it tastes awful and it works, but the underlying message there is it works because it tastes awful. That is, medicine is not supposed to taste good. And when you have a virus that you want to murder in your body, you want the strongest medicine that you can have. And so they leaned into this with things like not new and not improved. Our largest size is 200 milliliters because any larger would be cruel, and so on, and create a really fun campaign, catapulting themselves to #1 in the marketplace in Canada. They were later acquired by a big pharmaceutical company for an undisclosed amount of money. The last version of this is something that I'll give you for your own toolkit. So thinking in reverse is not something that we naturally do, and so sometimes we have to force ourselves to do it. So when I work with companies that are trying to innovate, one of the things that we can do is a special brainstorming task that I call shitstorming. And so think about the challenges of a typical brainstorming task, right? So you're supposed to have wild ideas and not hold back and not criticize ideas, and yet people always hold back and they don't give wild ideas. And frankly, they don't really have much fun, and it's hard to be creative if you're not really in a positive mood and having a good time. And so with shitstorming, your goal is to brainstorm truly terrible ideas, like the worst possible ideas. Now, this is great, and first of all, because it's a great warm-up for any sort of innovation task, because it is a lot of fun to shitstorm. Second of all, you can't really be criticized, right? So someone could go, that idea is not so bad. That's not a bad critique to receive. And then the beautiful thing is, on occasion, someone comes up with an idea in an attempt to come up with a bad idea that someone says, wait, hold on, that's so crazy, it might actually work. And so this shitstorming task is a very fun, sometimes incredibly useful task, but it's certainly a way to step away from the status quo because of your ability to think in reverse. So the second lesson I call create a chasm. This is in the 3rd chapter of Shtick to Business. And so in my MBA class, I do this exercise. I'll do it with you very quickly right now. So I present my students this customer satisfaction figure, right? So it's a very simple figure. So on the x-axis is from love to hate, and on the y-axis is a percentage of respondents, and you see 2 brands here, brand A and brand B. So I asked my students, which brand do they want to manage, brand A or brand B? And you could see, some stark differences between the two. So brand B, no one loves, no one hates, everybody's sort of in the middle. And brand A, people either love it or hate it. And this is a spirited debate. Some students want A and some students want B. And I always make the case for brand A. And that is that brand A is like a comedian. That is, it has a group of people who love it. And one of the beautiful things about comedians is all they care about is their audience and whether the audience in front of them is laughing or not. And they know that in order to make that audience laugh, they have to risk making another audience not laugh. They create a chasm. And so in a world that wants hot tea or iced tea, if you serve them warm tea, in order to try to make everyone happy, you make no one happy. And brand B is warm tea. Okay? And so the benefit of brand A is you have customers who love you. That is, they're loyal, they're less price sensitive, they engage in positive word of mouth. They don't even just, and when they do complain, they complain because they're trying to help you out. And the evidence is that these sort of polarizing brands are often more stable, especially in sort of tumultuous times. So if you think about it, some of the world's biggest, best brands are like brand A. They're like comedians. You love them or hate them. For example, you ask someone, do you like Starbucks? Oh my God, I love Starbucks. Really? Why do you love Starbucks? Oh, well, there's a Starbucks on every corner. And whether I'm in Chicago or Cusco or Cairo, I can get my Frappuccino. And ask someone else, do you like Starbucks? Oh my God, I hate Starbucks. Really? Why? Well, there's a Starbucks on every corner, and whether you're in Chicago or Cusco or Cairo, you get exactly the same thing. And they have these stupid drinks like Frappuccinos. I just want a old school, cappuccino. So if you think about it, well, in order to understand why comedians are so interested in creating a chasm, you have to understand what makes things funny more generally. And the work that we've done in the Humor Research Lab suggests that the things that are funny are things that are wrong yet okay, things that are threatening yet safe, or what we call benign violations. So this is a visual version of the benign violation theory. And so what you're doing as a comedian or as someone else who's pursuing laughs is you're looking for that sweet spot between wrong and okay, or benign and violation. Now, the thing about the benign violations is that they are wholly determined by the perceptions and values and culture of the audience. That is, that you can have the very same joke. First of all, jokes fail in two ways. They can be too boring, they can be too benign, or they can be offensive. They can be completely wrong. But the problem is that the very same joke can make one person laugh, hit that sweet spot right here in the middle, or can create boredom or offense in three different people, which suggests that targeting is paramount to comedians. Comedians actually understand segmentation and targeting better than most brands do. They recognize that in order to make people laugh, or in the case, thrill them with regard to a product, you have to understand what their values are, what their beliefs are, what their needs are. That's there. And so sometimes you find this working, right? I'm living in California right now. I'm on sabbatical. Lots to like about California: beaches, mountains, deserts, big cities, country, etc. There's a lot to like. But imagine you're Nebraska, right? You're Nebraska. Well, Nebraska understands that that they're not for everyone, and they were willing to actually say that in their recent change of their state motto, which is Nebraska. Honestly, it's not for everyone. A bit of outstanding marketing while also being a little bit cheeky there too. So I'll give you one last example of this and then give you an implication before I wrap up. So obviously gyms, for the most part are closed right now. I'm looking forward to them opening up again. One of the more fascinating gyms in my neighborhood is called Barry's Boot Camp. So Barry's Boot Camp is a high intensity training. I know there's some in London, New York. Prior to the pandemic, they were growing like crazy. And it's not because Barry's works. I mean, Barry's does work. There's hard runs on the treadmill and calisthenics and weights in the fitness room. But there's lots of alternatives to Barry's. Why is it that Barry's is so popular? Especially Barry's is popular with the kind of celebrity, young, beautiful crowd. So Jake Gyllenhaal works out there. Some of the Kardashians work out there and so on. Well, I went down the street and I went to Barry's. The fascinating thing about Barry's, first of all, is the volume is crazy loud. It's like working out in a nightclub. It's so loud, I went out to the front desk and asked if they had earplugs, and they did. And they gave them to me. And I was the only old fart in the place wearing them. The second thing is the room is bathed in red light. So it's like you are working out in the red light district in Amsterdam. And it's a red light district for a reason, because when you're in red light, you look fabulous. Like your skin looks great. It's amazing. And And it looks so good, and people work out. The men will take their shirts off in the middle of class and work out. People are practically naked in the class. So as you can imagine, not everybody finds this appealing, but if Barry's turned off the red lights, turned down the volume, and made it like a more normal place, then I would be happy, but Jake Gyllenhaal wouldn't be happy. So Barry serves hot tea. They're not out there serving warm tea. They're behaving like a comedian. They're behaving like a brand that polarizes. I'm gonna wrap this up right now, but the last thing that I want to say is there's an implication for you and your business, which is when you look at customer satisfaction, you want to look at figures. And the reason why you want to look at figures is because in this figure, brand A and brand B both have exactly the same customer satisfaction score. They both get a 3 on this scale. But what really matters is the frequencies, is the distribution, not the average. And so, so stop throwing away data and looking at averages for customer satisfaction. Look at those distributions because you want people who love you most of all. And with that, I will wrap up and say hello to Rory. Hi, Rory.
Hello, what a fantastic pleasure. I'll just very quickly, it echoes something I say in my book, which is don't solve for average. And I occasionally use phrases like nobody gets an endorphin rush from mid-market retail. You know, we get a thrill from an extravagance and we get a thrill from a bargain, but the middle doesn't really do it. Just a little question for me. If you, like, I think me and my team tend to think backwards.
Okay.
A,
yes.
humor helps.
Yes.
B, it may be that humor is an evolutionary necessity, because if you think backwards very frequently, 5% of the time you're a genius to everybody else. The other 95% of the time you're kind of irritating. And does benign violation provide us with a way of changing people's or advancing an opposing frame of reference to a group without it seeming a threat to their confirmation bias? That's my interesting question. So in collective decision-making, is there a really valuable role for humor, which is it's a form of correction without threat?
Yes. Unfortunately, I think the answer is yes, but it's a yes, but. And the problem is that creating these benign violations is very difficult to do. And so the world's funniest people will argue that you need natural talent to do it. The problem with their rationale, of course, is that none of them are like 18 years old and just naturally talented. They're 38 years old, there's 48 years old, because it takes a long time to be able to hone this craft. And so I do think that that this sort of evolutionary side of comedy works, which is that you have this sort of harmless threat. And so when done successfully, can take something that can be threatening and make it accessible and make it okay and make it enjoyable. The problem is making that benign violation is difficult and challenging. And so there's often almost a scientific method, at least an agile method. I like to say that vaudeville was the first lean startup, where you're testing, paying attention, revising, testing, and paying attention. So as long as you can get those intermediate steps, then yes, definitely.
A couple of questions from Slido. Why is humor so context dependent? E.g., people more likely to laugh if they're already in a good mood or surrounded by other laughing people. Can priming with happy cues make humor more effective?
Yeah, so first
That's
of all,
Alan Mitchell. Thank you,
Alan's observation is correct. So comedy works best when other people are around you, and obviously laughter is which is one element of this sort of positive side of this. So there's a behavioral element, which is the laughing, and then there's that positive emotion. So positive emotions are associated with non-threatening situations, right? And so positive emotions already help the benign side of that Venn diagram. And then also the actual laughter part of it is part of the social element to it. So if you think about it, what laughter really does is it signals that rustling in the bushes that seems threatening is actually safe. And so you don't need language to do that. So that can, so animals can do that, babies can do that, and cross-culturally we can do that. But yes, being in a good mood is a great way to help facilitate jokes. And so is
one final question, which I think is a great one. I think a lot of problems are only solved obliquely. They're solved by an oblique intervention. And Joel Bailey here asks, in a brittle period of cultural warfare, with lots of sensitive identity politics around, what do organizations need to consider? How do they need to consider using comedy in this context? My own view is we're often taking comedy off the air. For example, an episode of Faulty Towers, which was already satirizing something in the 1970s. Clearly, I remember watching it live in the 1970s. Had a young person uttered the same statement, it wouldn't have been funny. Okay. Yes. And yet, if you have this absolute sort of cult of humorless signaling of intensity, does that actually prove an obstacle to solving the problem?
Yeah, I think the answer is it's an obstacle, but it doesn't mean you shouldn't try. But what happens is that you need to be especially creative and good during these very difficult times, or you need to be willing for some people to be unhappy with you. And so what I often say is, like, you get these sort of big time American comedians like Jerry Seinfeld saying, I'm not going to play college campuses anymore. The students are too sensitive. I think that's a failure in opportunity. And I look forward to are the young comics who are coming up who are going to take a new approach in order to be able to do this. So the answer is yes, I think it can be done, but it's even more delicate than ever. And unless you can make sure you can really nail it and do it well, you're better off playing it a little bit safe.
So very simply, I mean, one of the great things about benign violation theory is it does allow you to say things that under a non-humorous context you couldn't say. The Economist, okay, I never read The Economist, management trainee age 42, is a way of saying something humorously, which if you said it straight would be actually slightly odious. And I think it's very, very interesting the extent to which we actually, humor is a portal into our brains of new ideas or new frames. And it has a huge value for that. I'm afraid I've been told I've got to wrap now. I'll be back very shortly. But Peter, all I can say is that is astoundingly useful. And we can see recurring patterns from that re-emerging everywhere. Thank you very much indeed. Really tremendous. And thanks for getting up so early too.
My pleasure.